Today, we're lucky to have Dr. Thomas Wishgall with us. He is our resident expert on visualization, augmented reality, virtual reality, graphics, um, parallel processing with graphics cards, data science, and kind of all things related to visualizing and understanding data and information. And he's going to talk to us today a little bit about data science and visualization using XR, which includes augmented reality and visual reality kinds of technologies. So, Thomas, thanks very much for preparing a mini lecture for us today. I will turn it over to you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Mike. I'm going to share my entire screen, so I'm not sure if I can see comments. If you have an urgent question, feel free to just interrupt me verbally. Okay. So, thanks for joining me. I want to give a little brief introduction to visualization using different display systems. And it's going to be very brief because, well, we only want to give a little bit of an overview. And so therefore, there's not much time to go into all the details. But in general, if you think of visualization, it follows the usual idea. What people say a lot: this picture says is worth 1,000 words, and so visualization is essentially following that concept. That we're trying to generate images to provide some insight into whatever data it is you're currently looking at. And take note of the plural in the word images, because usually it's not just a single image that we're trying to generate. A big part of visualization is to come up with an interactive system that people can use to explore the data. So it's not just a single image, but a sequence of images. And in order to derive the visualization, usually the process involves a sequence of steps that we have to go through different operations to get from the actual data to the final visualization, or the system that allows us to interact with those visualizations. And in visualization, therefore, you see the same concept that you'll encounter in computer science almost everywhere. Is this divide and conquer idea. So we're trying to break up the overall problem into smaller chunks that are essentially more manageable, so small enough so that you can more easily wrap your head around it and basically address and solve them, and come up with these individual components that we then can piece together to form the entire visualization system. And from a software engineering aspect, the advantage of going that approach, using this approach as well, is that we can come up with modular components that ideally we can reuse in other visualizations. For example, if you have something that loads a data set, that may be something you can reuse for a different visualization system that you develop later on other projects. So then these modules, in order to combine them to form the overall system, usually they're combined in some form of a pipeline, so that basically the data flows through this entire pipeline and gets transformed or manipulated in a certain way, so that we ultimately end up with the final visualization, the output image for that matter, or sequence of images, since it's supposed to be interactive. And this sequence of data transformations then essentially is referred to as the visualization process, this visualization pipeline. And the word pipeline is probably a little too simplistic of a term, because it doesn't have to be just a linear sequence of modules that we kind of like put together. The pipeline in that sense can branch off or merge. So it can be relatively complex in the end, depending on what your visualization system is supposed to be doing. Shows you a very simplistic example of such a pipeline, but I think it gets the idea across of what it is we're trying to do. So you see on the left side, the top side, the raw data. So that's essentially the data that, I don't know, somebody gave to you or you generated in some way, and essentially the data that we're trying to now visualize. So then, of course, as the first step, what we would have to do is import it into memory so that we can manipulate it and do stuff with it. So that leads us then to this imported data set. in this case, for example, a polygonal data set, bunch of triangles representing some form of geometry. And there may be data associated with all these different vertices, different spots where all these triangles connects. Of course, that completely depends on what data you're using right now. Then the next step is usually an important step, this data enrichment, transformation, resampling step, where we usually try to generate additional information that we can then use and feed into the subsequent steps of the visualization pipeline to make the visualization to make things look nicer, or to enable us to use specific visualization algorithms. For example, the resampling part, the volume rendering algorithm that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit, usually involves or requires you to resample the data set if it's not given in a regular representation that it basically expects. And for those cases, you will have to essentially resample the data set, usually something you would want to avoid, but in those cases, can't get around it. But oftentimes the data set is already in the proper format, and therefore we don't necessarily have to resample. So that then, of course, gets us this enriched data set, which is, of course, still similar to what we had originally, this polygonal structure, the bunch of triangles that represents the geometry. But you can see already that we calculated an additional entity that represented just the color, just to visualize the data set at this step. And I'm not sure with the compression going on if you can see these little blue arrows all around. That's also computed in this data enrichment step, essentially, which in this case is the so-called normal vector. So essentially a bunch of vectors that are orthogonal to, in this case, the outside surface of our data set. You'll see these being computed quite a lot in visualization, because from a computer graphics perspective, those are needed to essentially make things look pretty, allows us to render things to look more natural, the way we basically usually encounter things in real life. So these vectors, these so-called normal vectors, are actually pretty useful in a lot of different examples for visualization. I will show you the difference in the live demo that I'm going to show afterwards. So now that we then have enriched the data and have generated maybe some scalar entities, these normal vectors, then we can actually map the data into some visual representation that allows the user to essentially interpret the data. Usually involves some kind of abstraction from the actual data, some geometric representation. So you can see from this blobby rendering here that in this case, we're still using the same data set. We still have this spherical overall shape, but now we're essentially bumped it out in direction of the normal vector based on the scalar entity that we calculated. So it actually changed the overall surface representation to encode the underlying data. So that gives you another example of where these normal vectors can actually be used for. And then, of course, finally, we actually render the data to generate the final image, which is essentially something along these lines here. I had to throw the final image on the slide to actually showcase the individual representations, but that essentially would be something like the final visualization of this particular data set. Of course, fairly simple example, just to give you something to see what this is about. So the example I'm going to showcase today is essentially volume rendering. And it can be applied to a whole bunch of different examples. And I'm showing a few on these slides. I hope you can at least recognize some of those through WebEx and all the compression that it, comes with it. The canonical example that initially was used, I don't want to say only for that example, but a lot was the medical example. Medical data such as CT or MRI scan or PET scans or any of those usually have some kind of a, like, volumetric representation, which is basically a regular grid that we have data points at the individual vertices of that particular grid. So it's pretty much similar, very similar to just an image, where we essentially have just a rectangular grid with pixel values at each data point. So it's essentially a sampling of that of a rectangle, where we have, in case of the image, color values. And the only difference between the volume is that it's basically the same thing blown up into 3D. So we have essentially an image at the front, stacked right behind that is another image, then another image, and so forth, to give you the same idea, the same concept, just in 3D. You can see the medical example shown right here, which is essentially the hips and part of the torso. That then volume rendering was used to that particular scan. There's a lot of other examples that you can apply this to as well. So anything that has this fairly regular structure, this regular grid with sampled data points at each of those grid cells or grid points, if you will. For all of those data sets, you can basically use this. Or, as I mentioned when I talked about the pipeline, you can always resample the data to get it into that structure and then apply volume rendering. Has the little caveat with resampling, essentially doing multiple interpolations if you do so, and that can create artifacts. So you have to be a little careful and aware of that. But it applies to all sorts of different examples. You can see just a few. So I have fluid dynamics listed here. So the top right corner is lattice Boltzmann simulation. Lattice Boltzmann is essentially a simple way of doing CFD type-ish simulations, usually more from a visual perspective. But if you use a fine enough grid, it works well for more complex things as well. So you can use that for those examples. Astronomical data right below that. So this is essentially a supernova, and you can use volume rendering for that. So you just pick a scalar entity, and you have to pick a certain color scheme. I'll talk about that in just a second to essentially make this look good. So there's quite a bit that goes into making the volume rendering look decent, in addition to the concept of the algorithm itself. There's other examples as well. So you can see a water molecule, the rendering here, essentially the field representation. So you can use a volume rendering for that. You can scan your engine similar to what a hospital scanner would do for like an engine part or the whole engine if you want to. Since there's usually metal involved, you basically X-rays and metal doesn't really work too well together because the X-rays get scattered by the metal. But since the engine is a dead part, it's not a live human for that matter. We can usually crank up the X-ray source and get decent results. But same idea as a CT scan, essentially, that you can use for engine parts. And so therefore, the data that you get is following the same format, so you can apply the same rendering techniques. And there's a whole bunch of different algorithms that you can apply to, or that you can use to do volume rendering. I'm not going to go into any detail at this point. My class actually spends a few weeks on just volume rendering alone, so it's quite a bit involved in terms of all the different algorithms. But the basic concept behind all of those is essentially what you see in this this simple picture here. So we have on the left side a light source that basically sheds out light, sun or whatever you want to consider that, and then this model right here is essentially the volume that we're trying to render. So I actually use volume rendering to show you generate this particular image. And then originally the data consists of basically just scalar values that represents the particular sampled data at a specific point in 3D space. So there's usually no color value or anything associated with it. So that's a step which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So we kind of associate some kind of a color value and transparency value to each of those data points. And once we've done that, we have a somewhat translucent blend of data, if you want to think of this conceptually. And when we shed light through that, then we can, depending on what transparency values or how we basically define these for all these sample points, then we can essentially see the accumulated light that basically allows or is allowed to get through this entire mass. And then we basically use that to project that onto this particular image. So if you think of this as like a very pointed light source, sheds out a whole lot of light, and we measure in the end how much of that light makes it through and what kind of color it will have after we accumulated all the light passing through all these different sample points based on the transparency value, of course, and color value for that matter. Some light will basically be eliminated or cut down or filtered out, depending on how you want to look at it. And we're essentially looking for the residual value that makes it through onto the screen, which then gives us that volume rendered image in the end. So it's essentially the combination of how much light makes it through plus the projection onto our screen for that matter. And so the tricky part is how do we actually associate color values to the individual samples that we encounter. So usually that's where essentially these so-called transfer functions come in. So as I pointed out before, the volumetric data is essentially represented as a regular grid, and at each grid point we have a data value. Again, similar to an image, just blown up into 3D. And this grid is just an artificial construct that we use to basically represent our data. If you think of the medical example, then we take a scan of, I don't know, the whole body or a body part. And this grid, of course, if you think about this conceptually, has nothing to the human body. The human body couldn't care less about what we superimpose on it. It's just our way of representing that particular data. And then the particular data values are usually then some kind of scalar value. It doesn't necessarily have to for the volume rendering. We have to break it down to a single data value so we can manipulate different data types in different ways. But ultimately, we'll have to break it down to a scalar entity to some point, or something at least that we can convert into color and transparency values. So with the medical example, if we stick with that, typically you see scalar values with ranges which are basically represented as 12-bit integers. So if you get a medical data set such as a CT or MRI scan, that's usually how it is represented. And then we have to take that scalar entity and associate colors and transparency values to it. And again, that's what this transfer function is supposed to be doing. You see on the right side here, that's actually the transfer function I used to generate the volume rendering on the previous image. This one right here. So it's the exact same transfer value, transfer function to generate that specific image. And I'll show you that live in just a second once I'm, well, a few minutes, once I'm done with my slides. So essentially, the way this is structured is this range here on the x-axis is all the data values that are that occur in our data sets. So for example, the entire 12-bit range of data values that can technically occur. And then on this axis, we have the transparency value. So how transparent a particular data value is supposed to be. So at the bottom, it's completely transparent. So all the light basically passes through. And at the top, it's completely opaque. So none of the light passes through. And somewhere in the middle, then we get semi-transparent. So essentially, if you looked up a particular data value right here, if you go up, then this tells us exactly what transparency value we want to associate with that particular data value. So everywhere this data value occurs, we're essentially using that specific transparency. And then this bottom part here represents the color encoding, the color value that we're assigning to this particular data value. So same idea here, we look up this value here, this the scalar entity that comes from the actual data, And then we look up here, the actual color that we want to associate with it. So in this case, it's just a color rainbow going from blue to red. And we can see these little points here. We can actually move those to manipulate the transfer function so that we can essentially change the range of colors, how they are associated to individual data values. Um, and that's essentially the key element that we need to convert the color value, the intensity values to color and transparency values. And then that gets applied to basically every data value. And then if I go back to my previous slide, we do this shining light through projection idea to basically map the whole volume onto a single plane so that we can essentially render it on a computer screen. So then once we are capable of doing that, we can essentially play around with this and um, use this kind of an idea on all sorts of different systems. Obviously, we can use a desktop system. That's fairly easy, pretty straightforward. We could use head-mounted displays as well, like a Vive or an Oculus. We can use cave-type systems. So you see me on the right side here, standing in one of them. So these cave-type systems it's essentially a full room. In this case, it's like a 10 by 10 footprint that you can just walk through just like through any other room. The difference here is, though, that as you can see here, there's images basically projected on all walls right here. So all the walls, at least 4 of them, are basically projection surfaces. And there's a smooth transition from one wall to the next or the wall to the floor. So there's a seamless image basically popping up in front of you. And on top of that, the system actually is capable of figuring out where you, as the user, this could be wearing the 3D glasses, is actually standing. So there's 2 components here. So there's the tracking part. You see kind of this purple reddish glow. Those are actually cameras capturing me and calculating the 3D position. And then the stereo glasses, the system actually shows 2 images at the same, well, not exactly the same time, alternating in an alternating fashion, synced up with the stereo glasses, so that I can actually see different images with my left and right eye. So I actually perceive things in 3D when I'm in there. And then the system, because it knows where my head is located at, it can recreate that exact perspective. So on the simple picture here, it doesn't really look very spectacular, simply because you don't have that 3D perception. A camera just can't convey that, and well, PowerPoint for that matter can't either. And but for me standing in there, I can actually see this. In this case, the CT scan floating right in front of me, and I see it perfectly in 3D. And because of the 3D tracking, because the system knows where my head is, and is able to recreate that exact perspective from my viewpoint, wherever my head is at the time, the data basically now floats right in front of me, and I can literally stick my head in there and look around, and it'll stay right there, um, and I can inspect all sorts of different aspects of the data. So it's actually a really cool experience. If you ever get to Wright State, and once we're back open, you should basically try it out sometimes, because the image doesn't do it any justice, really. It's quite an impressive experience just to see it for yourself. And similarly, we can of course use other displays. So this shows here an augmented reality display or device, which is a similar or follows a similar idea than head-mounted displays, where you have basically 2 screens in front of your eyes. The difference is now those are translucent, so it can basically superimpose an image onto the real world. So you're not completely shut off the real world. It just adds, hence augmented reality. It adds elements to the real world scene so that you can show enhancements or additional information on top of the real world. So it makes it a pretty cool interface, and I'm currently working on a volume rendering application for that. I can't show you this to you because the surface I'm using here doesn't have the graphics capability to do a live demonstration with that, unfortunately. Otherwise, you would basically be able to see exactly as I'm wearing the headset. I can project it onto even through WebEx, but it needs one of a more powerful ATI or NVIDIA or AMD and NVIDIA graphics card for that to work properly, which the Surface does not have, unfortunately. But the basic point is, once we have a handle on this volume rendering, we can use this on all sorts of different displays. We can use the cave type display, as you can see here. We can use our tile displays, basically a large display, and display it on there. So pretty much anything you want to do with it, which is really powerful and gives you a lot of interactions with this particular data. So you can actually see for sure or for yourself what's in there and how it basically looks, and maybe from a doctor's perspective, what's wrong and what needs to be fixed in a specific patient's case. So with that, I want to switch over to basically the demo part. So this is a software that is basically capable of doing volume rendering already. So it's called paraview. You can download it yourself. It's basically freely available. It's actually open source because it's built on BTK. And all I've done so far is basically just load the data set. I haven't done anything else. Just open the data set. It's not like it takes a whole lot of time, but I figured that's a really boring part that I don't need to talk or show you in the presentation. So right now it doesn't really show you anything exciting. It's basically just a cube, for that matter, or that we can look at, and doesn't resemble the volume all that much at all. And the reason for that is simply because right now the representation that we picked is set to outline, which is just the extent of the overall data. As far as whatever we scanned in there, it's kind of meaningless, but from a computer science perspective, well, we always care about how data is presented because that's our bread and butter. That's how we can apply algorithms and manipulate data. So for us, it's important. If I go to the information part, we can see a little more about what the data is actually about. So you can see that we have data values ranging from minus 1024 to 1640. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what data you can expect. Very rudimentary, of course. And then it gives you an idea of the dimensions of the data set. And I loaded this as a DICOM file. So in this case, DICOM files, medical scanners for that matter, are always nicely calibrated. So they know exactly the dimensions of the data, how far apart points are, for example. That's what it shows down here. Basically, this is the overall dimension for the entire data set, but this is an actual dimensional unit. So it's actually in the metric system, metric units. So if I go back to the properties, so the interesting part, of course, is now the volume rendering. So therefore, let's switch over to actually representing the volume. And there we go. So now I hope you can see this a little bit. So this is a similar scan that I showed you in the cave system and on the slide as well. So it's a scan of a heart, and in this case, a pig heart, though not a human heart. But this already shows you that, or the importance of why we actually need a transfer function. So this now shows you basically just the outside of the scanned part. In this case, well, it's basically the way this was scanned. We kind of like limited it to this the cylindrical shape. That's just part of the scanner section. So we selected a subsection of what it's supposed to be storing. And usually this outside representation is probably the most uninteresting part within this data, because if you wanted to see the outside, well, we would look at the outside. So if you stick with the medical example, the doctor doesn't want to see the skin on a patient on the CT scan because, well, if the doctor wanted to examine the skin, he or she would just examine the skin because it's readily available. You want to see what's inside. That's the motivation of why we would do a CT or MRI scan. So what we would like to do then is basically tweak these transparency values so that this outside part, of all the material on the outside, is basically transparent so that we can actually look inside. And all we have to do is basically manipulate these points. So if I click in here, it creates a new data point. on our transfer function that can now move this around. And now this whole section from the very left to that point that I just created is now completely transparent. And now we can actually see what's inside of our data. So in this case, now we can actually see that it is in fact heart. You see a little bit of the heart. You see the bones, the ribs. Uh, you see some of the pulmonary vessels right here. So this gives you a lot of insight. And the nice thing is the interactivity part with visualization, that I can now manipulate this in any way I like to include, for example, more data. I can create a new point right here, for example, to make the cutoff a little sharper. And that essentially allows me to interactively drill down on whatever I'm looking for. Usually medical data is very well calibrated so that I don't necessarily have to, that I essentially know what kind of tissue values correspond to what intensity values. But um, still, depending on, because there's overlap between different tissues, oftentimes you still have to tweak things a little bit. This also allows you to select kind of like color values or color mappings, for example. So we could, for example, use this one to pick a different color value, color range. You can see now it added all these dots. And again, I can move those around to adjust essentially the way it maps the colors to the intensity values. We talked about when we looked at the pipeline, the visualization pipeline, we looked at enhancements or data enrichment phase, particularly the normal vectors. And you can essentially do the same thing with these volumetric data sets. Even though we don't have necessarily a surface representation, you can still calculate normal vectors. People use the gradient, which is essentially the highest direction of the highest change in material, which is usually a good representation of a surface-ish type. And when I do this, now it actually looks a lot nicer. Now we can actually use computer graphics to make this look much more like a surface or a real object. So we can see a lot more now. And we can play with this a little more and enhance the rendering phase itself, use this ray tracing, which is a pretty fancy way of rendering things, a pretty computationally intensive way as well. So that makes this look even better. So you can see now that it almost looks like a real object. So you can actually tweak these things in such a way that it looks fairly realistic. It doesn't have all the bloody stuff. So that probably makes it better from that perspective. But it allows you to actually do pretty fancy renderings to make this look really realistic. You can even adjust it. For example, we can add shadows to it, which of course, medical data set may not make as much sense, but it shows you from a graphics perspective all the cool things you can do. So now actually the geometry that we're looking at casts shadows onto itself. It makes it even more realistic from an object perspective or rendering perspective, um, as that's basically what we use. If you have a natural scene, well, physics basically does this type of lighting all the time automatically. That's just the way nature is. So from a rendering quality perspective, there's a lot of fancy things you can do. And even this little surface here can keep up with this pretty well, considering how rendering or computationally intensive ray tracing actually is. And that was the gist of what I was trying to get across. I hope you're still with me. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask directly or type them in.
Fantastic. That was
Back
really
to the
interesting.
view.
While you're getting back, I'll start us off with a question. So first of all, those of you who are joining us, feel free to type into the chat window if you'd like to ask Dr. Wishgall a question, or in a second, I'll see if anybody wants to just unmute. If you've got a really long question, sometimes it's easier just to ask them verbally. So, really interesting. I kind of think about. I never really thought about the fact that in medical imaging, you've got returns, you've got data for every single area, and you've got to mask a lot of it out to get down to the things that you're interested in. Um, and so I can see that that's got all kinds of uses for different kinds of medical data. Do you do the same kind of things for other kinds of data? Is there like, I don't know, weather modeling or atmospheric data? Are there other, it seems like biomedicine is probably the main application for volumetric rendering, but are there other ones out there that are commonly in use?
Definitely. Interestingly enough, volume rendering wasn't developed for medical stuff.
Really?
It was modeled for cloud rendering. It's a computer graphic principle because cloud are essentially a volumetric mass with different, if you sample it with different humidity values in that sense, and then you use that exact same to render
Ah,
the clouds, and that gives you
makes
pretty better
sense.
results because it models the physics behind it.
Right, right.
Um, but yeah, you can use it for any kind of atmospheric modeling as well. A lot of weather data is projected onto the surface. If you look at a radar or image data, with radar you can probably get 3D data. It gets pretty complex and pretty big for that matter.
Have people tried to do volumetric rendering with non-physical data? Like if I've got a big bioinformatics data set and I project it into 3 dimensions and then look for, with certain settings on thresholds, look for globs that show up in those 3 dimensions, does it tell me something interesting about my original data?
Not sure I've seen it with volume rendering. I know the what was it, the TOD algorithm? Uh,
Right,
they
right.
I've seen Derek's student use at least image representations in a similar way to represent the results that he was looking at to figure out what's basically going on.
Right, right,
Usually, for this type of data, you probably would stick with 2D more um, because it makes it a little easier to see from just from a visual, computational, or visually processing the data. So it makes it a little easier for us humans to interpret the data.
right. Let me say one last thing. You're welcome to ask, in addition to questions about um, graphics, visualization, augmented reality, the specific topics. I can tell you that Thomas is also an expert on using GPUs for various tasks and for and on. We didn't talk about it too much today, but all kinds of augmented and virtual reality platforms. Um, and I'm also happy to answer any questions that you might have about Right State or classes or preparing to do work in graphics, what classes in math you need to know, that sort of thing. Um, so yeah, any questions that we can answer for you um, while we're all together?
On the topic of math, um, as you can imagine, all the things I talked about, they all involve math to various degrees. So math is actually important. The nice thing about all this graphics and visualization stuff is, um, from a math perspective, you can actually see what it's good for. I usually start my graphics class with like a uh, refresher for all the math stuff, and I try to use graphical representations. And um, oftentimes the students have kind of this aha moment, kind of, oh, this is what this is used for, and this is why this behaves like this. And
Right, right, exactly. And why, yeah, yeah. Um, Graphics is one of those fantastic domains where the math sometimes clicks and you understand, what it's there for in the first place and how it relates to reality in a way that actually makes it useful and interesting. Um, and yeah, is often, I think, like an aha moment for students to say, oh, now this is really interesting math. It's not just a set of equations that don't attach to the real world in any way. Yeah. Thank you very much, Thomas. I appreciate it. It's been very interesting. I hope that we'll see you back next week to hear about machine learning in healthcare. And thanks everyone for being here.
yep, thanks everyone.